Once upon a time, I began what was supposed to be a small RWBY fan comic project, summarizing the backstory of Cinder Fall. And 2 years later, I finally finished it. Midnight isn't a long story. In fact, it's roughly 20 pages long. It only took me 2 years because dramatic comics are notoriously difficult for me. Let's just say I'm a good enough visual storyteller to know exactly how bad I am, and leave it at that. Anyway, as you might have guessed, this is a rewrite of Cinder's portion of the Midnight episode from Volume 8, which follows a similar premise, but changes the plot to explain things that the fans were actually eager to know at the time. For example, how did Cinder meet Salem? Why does Cinder remain subservient to Salem despite her bloodthirsty, power-hungry nature? What might be the psychological rationale behind Cinder's desires and actions? To this day, the source material hasn't offered any substantial answers to these questions. And seeing as the fate of Volume 10 ranges from unlikely to unknown, it's possible we may never actually get those answers. So I decided to rewrite Cinder's character for myself. There's a link in the description to the full comic, contained in a series of Tumblr posts all conveniently linked together. All you have to do to read it is just click Story Start, and then just keep clicking Next. I highly recommend giving it a try. But in any case, I'm going to briefly summarize it right here and now. Just like in the canon, Cinder is purchased by the Madam and put to work as her personal servant. One day, a mysterious stranger arrives at the hotel and invites Cinder to have tea with her every afternoon, listening to her concerns and her frustrations, which, of course, no one has ever done for poor Cinder before. She appreciates this enough to overlook the stranger's insensitive comments about how her suffering is her own fault for being too weak to do anything about it. Later on, there's a masquerade ball at the Glass Unicorn, and the stranger asks Cinder if she wants to attend. As usual, Cinder tries to ignore her ridiculous suggestions, knowing that the Madam would punish her severely if she even thought about going. But suddenly, the stranger produces a key to unlock the shock collar, and for the first time, Cinder feels like it might actually be safe to give in to her temptations. She borrows one of her stepsister's dresses, a feathered mask, and a pair of glass slippers, and tries to blend in with the crowd. For a few shining moments, she feels as if she might actually be able to enjoy herself. Unfortunately, the Madam eventually catches her, clearly willing to punish her even without the shock collar. But before she can slap her, Cinder catches her hand and accidentally activates her semblance, setting her evil stepmother on fire. At first she's horrified, but soon she decides on purpose to unleash her power, burning the Madam alive and reducing the Glass Unicorn to ashes. She feels that the stranger was right all along, that she always had the power to free herself and spent years in servitude for nothing, and the devastating shame of that realization stays with her to the present day. That's all that's covered by the actual comic, although I imagine that, after Cinder finishes with her brutal revenge, Salem will reveal her true identity and recruit her on the spot, teaching her how to fight, how to control her semblance, and probably also how to do the sexy, smirking villainous routine. She is truly the fairy godmother of this Cinderella story, the one that felt oddly absent from the canon version of the story. And while we're on the subject, I'd like to share some of my thoughts on why I decided to do this rewrite and how I think it works. Right from the beginning, I decided I didn't want a story where Cinder is just a bad seed who took advantage of Rhodes' kindness, aka ignorant platitudes to an abused child who clearly needed actual help, and projected a righteous future as a huntress to instead become a monster. It's not unbelievable that she might do this, it just doesn't add anything to her character. The sentiment at the end of Canon Midnight is freedom, but at what cost? But we already know Cinder is willing to destroy people for her own gain. All the backstory does is show us her first time doing that, I guess. It doesn't really make us feel like we've learned anything about her as a person. So I wanted to create a simple rationale for her actions. She's not a bad seed, she's just a human being who was taught a bad lesson. And that lesson is this. Being in a position where someone can hurt you or control you is not only unacceptable, it reflects badly on you as a person, and you should be ashamed of it. As Stranger Salem said, it's your fault. So you have to correct it, you have to burn away the shame. At least you have to try. But in reality, you can't. The memory of what Cinder let happen to her stays with her, and the humiliation stays with her. and the desperate need to erase it and prove she's not that weak girl anymore, over and over again, also stays with her. At its core, her hunger for power is a hunger for self-acceptance. When the day comes that no one can hurt her anymore, she will finally be able to stop feeling ashamed of herself. Of course, the paradox of her thinking that way and also being Salem's #1 puppet remains. But I think giving her a real relationship with Salem as part of her backstory helps to contextualize that too. Like, from the beginning, their dynamic is already apparent. Stranger Salem says cruel things to Cinder that make her angry, and rightfully so. But at the end of the day, she decides to humor her in return for the rare privilege of being invited to share a meal, and being spoken to like a human being, even if the words themselves are manipulative. Probably one of the first bad lessons she learned in her life was that some amount of abuse and discomfort is a fair trade for something you would never be able to obtain otherwise. And this lesson also stays with her to the present day. And regardless of how she might rationalize it, now Salem simply has a big enough role in Cinder's life to actually warrant that kind of paradoxical loyalty. After all, no matter how evil she might be, she's still the one who freed her. She's the one who redirected the path of her life. She's the one who raised her as a young woman, and she's the one who gave her access to the power she has and craves. Basically, you can't argue with results. Despite being aware of how expertly Salem pulls her strings, Cinder knows that being with her demon godmother is the only way she'll be able to satisfy that need for self-acceptance. And I think, really deep down, she's probably afraid of not having some controlling authority figure around to tell her what to do, because that's how she's lived her entire life. She never got the chance to know anything else. Thanks so much for watching. Like, subscribe, whatever, and I'll see you next time.